Riff listeners, I understand you are missing Jeremy right now. I really do. I understand. I'm missing Jeremy right now.
Yep.
He's still around.
He's texting me, but
we're walking through a couple of things with a guest, Marty Solomon. We started this conversation last week. Preston and I, name one thing out of that conversation that you walked away from thinking, oh, okay, well, that's
one thing.
That's game changing.
Oh, well, it's just reemphasizes, look at the Bible like a library. It's not a book. It's a library. And you're like, well, that does change things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That if I'm in a library, I'm like, oh, this was meant in this genre. I shouldn't read it like that genre.
Yes.
Oh, Marty Solomon's amazing.
It's good.
Really
so
like it.
If you haven't listened to part one, that's fine. Be a daredevil. Listen to part two and then part one. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how you watch Star Wars. How do you watch Star Wars? I mean, there's 9 of them.
Never seen an episode.
What?
I'm kidding.
Golly.
I watch them as they come out in theaters. That's how I watch them.
Okay. All right. So you're like a purist. So you start with 3.
That's how you're supposed to start.
Okay.
That's how I started.
So if you want to start with 2 today, fine. I'm not going to judge.
Yeah.
Preston's not judging. I think it'd be helpful to
they
start
may
at
be
1.
confused why he would refer to himself as the emperor, actually.
That is true.
That's in episode
You know what?
1.
Just listen to 1. Listen to the first one. Go back and then listen to part 1 and then listen to part 2.
Right.
I think it's going to be great. Glad you're here. Hope this is helpful. One of the things that North Point wants to do is create a safe place for people to find and follow Jesus. Our prayer is that people are walking into our doors and their scaffolding is falling apart, right? Like, so where do they start, right? If they're for some reason curious enough to even listen to the Riff or listen to BEMA, like with all of this knowledge that you're walking through and all of this history, where does somebody that feels like, the scaffolding's down and I'm just going to walk away?
Yep.
Where and what do you say to them to say, hey, I don't think the scaffolding's the point.
Yeah. Well, first of all, everything's going to, I say this in chapter 1 of my book, which was not on the original table of contents. Like that was the chapter that I wrote that when I got done, I was like, oh, that's not on the spreadsheet, but this is where we're starting. But the point is always going to be Jesus. The point is always going to be the person of the resurrected Christ. And that's the thing. Everything else facilitates that. Like I always tell my college students, ultimately this is about Jesus, just Jesus, nothing else, not Jesus not Jesus as long as, not Jesus but. And so, which are like, okay, yeah, duh. But at the same time, I'm not sure many people, for all the talk we do as evangelicals about a personal relationship with Jesus, I don't think most of us know what the heck that even, like, do I know Jesus personally? And I'm thankful again to my fundamentalist upbringing because I got to know Jesus personally. Like he talks to me and I don't use that as a weapon or I never talk about it. I never tell people what Jesus is telling me because it's so weird when you mix it with power dynamics, but Jesus is real. Like he's real in my life. He comforts me. He's spoken through prayer partners. He's active in my marriage. He shows up in my kids and my friends and worship and the Holy Spirit. Like, I don't know what to do with the Bible on some days. And I don't know. And I'm even less compelled and inspired by doctrine and theology and all that kind of stuff. But Jesus, man, Jesus is real. And the Bible has proven to be brilliant. But I did go through a phase where I had to be like, man, this is, because I really wasn't looking at the Bible. I was looking at all this dumb scaffolding that, like, to use that same metaphor, and those kind of things. But Jesus was so, and see, what I found is when you can cycle through that, I can now go back and embrace all those things. I don't have to leave any of those things. I just had to put them in their proper place. So now I can look at my faith tradition and be like, yeah, this is like, we are so dumb and screwed up sometimes. But this is what I love about my faith tradition, because it's not the vehicle that's getting me there, but it is really helpful for this and this and this. And that's why I love being here and being a part of this thing, not because it's perfect, not because it's right. I do believe it's right about a lot of things, but because it's not the thing. Jesus is the thing. The Bible is super helpful, and everything starts to find its proper place. Usually we get it all backwards. Hey, make sure you cling to our tradition because we're the ones getting the Bible right. And because we get the Bible right, you'll find Jesus. Right. It's backwards. Jesus, the Bible, that's why what we're doing is helpful. But we usually try to flip it because that's how you build a kingdom.
It's so good, man. It's just so good.
It's so helpful. And here, I want to reemphasize this. If people are listening and they're like, how do I have a conversation with Marty Solomon? Well, you probably won't, but you can.
You got to write a book.
Well,
you got to write a book.
No, I'm not saying
Preston
like that.
Ulmer.
You just made it weird. Stop. What I'm trying to say is read his book. Like, Marty, you wrote this so that people could have this, like everything you're talking about. You're saying, hey, I wrote this in chapter 1, all the way through, all your stories was written so that people could reorient their faith around a Jesus-looking God, interpret scriptures through a Jesus lens, correct?
Yes, and let me just say, I did not write this book because I'm an expert. I'm the last thing. I try to say that a million times in as many ways as I can on a million different platforms. I have been given a gift through other teachers that I long to share. And so I love to be like the middle, the go-between. I call myself the Robin Hood of theology. I love to steal from the theologically rich to give to the theologically poor.
You're the emperor.
Yeah, there's that too. We can't mix too many metaphors. It doesn't work. So I love to be the connecting point, because you can't quote me on a paper. I don't have the letters after my name, but I can point you to the direction of the people that were so helpful for me. That's my passion. That's what the podcast is, what the book is, YouTube channel. Like, everything I do is designed to meet people in these weird, awkward spaces of faith isn't working for me, and go, yes. And it's not because faith is wrong. It's because there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can get rid of. And there's some beautiful stuff behind door number 3. And so go read that and go look at this. And so all of this is just resources. I'm not right about all of it at all. But if we can create a safe space to ask those questions, to wrestle with the text, to have some tools, to share what's been helpful, then Jesus will do the work. Because this is just an imperfect cog in the thing that Jesus is doing, this bigger thing Jesus is doing. So yes, that is what the book is, and I do hope it's helpful for people, and I know that it has been. And it's the first of a 3-part conversation. We got more under contract. That was by design. So we got more coming. But that's awesome. We wanted to start with the Bible, because for evangelicals, it's always about what the Bible says. So let's start with the Bible before we talk about anything else.
So the first one, asking better questions of the Bible. Second one, getting all the answers from the Bible.
Right.
And then the third one, how to shove that down people's throats. It's the practical part of it. Yeah,
they won't even need the other two, because it's really about what we just talked about. The second book is about theology, and it's that third book that's really about love. Like, that's where it's all going to land. It's going to land in empathy.
Okay.
But we can't just talk about empathy, because everybody's going to be like, yeah, but the Bible says.
You're like, yeah.
And so we have to undo what we understand the Bible says.
I have something, an interesting, something that's thrown me into a wrestling match with my theology again, okay? We had someone on the show, Ofer, and he's been at our church before. He's an Israeli historian, right? Yeah.
Tour guide
in Israel.
Yeah.
He considers himself a secular Jew, if you were to put a label on it.
Okay.
Brilliant man.
Yep.
And I remember sitting with him, actually, Marty, at a Doubters Club, okay? And he was our co-host, and sitting with him, and he said, we're introduced ourselves, and I said, I'm a Jesus follower. And he said, actually, Preston, I follow Jesus closer than you do. Right? And it was this, we all laughed, and then I have to go home and wrestle with that. And then Tuesday, just a few days ago, I'm sitting with a guy that considers himself agnostic atheist, and he said, hey, I'm just not, I don't believe in God and all, but I am a Jesus follower. Right?
Yeah.
So you got a Christian and an atheist and a secular Jew saying they follow Jesus. And I'm going to ask a question that I believe, this is always a journey of actually, like, who is Jesus? And I think when you take the resurrection out of it, you don't have the Jesus of the Bible. But what do you say to people that would be like, hey, I'm not a Christian. I don't even know what I think about, but the ways of Jesus are so compelling, because that's what I'm getting at. All these stories are intrigued by the Jesus story. What do you say to someone like that?
I'd be like, yeah, I totally agree. And there are valid conversations to have about all that other stuff, and there's an appropriate place for things like apologetics and whatever. But I've always, like, one of my favorite, there's 2 stories I think about. One is from Peter Rollins out of The Orthodox Heretic, where he tells his own little parable about this missionary that goes to a village, and he finds that this village was there for the death of Jesus, but they left. These representatives left before the resurrection. And so they don't know. Like, they went back home, they told them a story about who Jesus was, and they told a story about how he was crucified. And this whole village like committed themselves to living the way of Jesus, but with no knowledge of the resurrection. And so the missionary's like, you guys, can I tell you what happened the day after you left? And the whole the whole village goes into this massive celebration. Yeah. Like, they're like, oh, we can't believe it. The resurrection, yes. Heaven, liberation. And this elder like goes out to the outskirts of the city and just sits, and he starts to weep and cry. And the missionary sees him, and he goes out to this elder and he says, why are you, old man? Like, why are you crying? He says, for all these years, my people have followed Jesus because it was the best way to live. And now my grandchildren will follow Jesus because of what they get out of it. And so in a lot of ways, I think about that friend of yours, that agnostic friend, and think they're probably actually a step ahead of so many of us. Okay, I have 3 stories. The second one would be a shorter Jewish story where there's the rabbis tell a story of a man, and this rabbi, whenever he prays for somebody, his prayers are always answered. And so he's late, he's on his way to synagogue, and there's this woman here, and she stops him, and she's like, Rabbi, would you pray for me? I just want to celebrate Passover this year. Passover is this weekend. I don't have enough money. Will you please just pray that I would? And so the rabbi's kind of frustrated. He's in a hurry. He's like, God, this woman just wants to be obedient. She just simply wants to host a Seder as your Torah commands. Would you give her the money she needs to do that? He goes into synagogue, completes his prayers, comes out of synagogue. The woman is there. She's like, Rabbi, you would never guess it. This couple came up and they just gave me a bag of money. It's enough to host Seder. But Rabbi, this couple doesn't, they've been trying to have a baby for years and they're struggling with infertility. Would you pray for them? And so the rabbi stops, and he's kind of frustrated because he's late to his next thing. So he raises his hands for a second and says, God, this couple just wants to be fruitful and multiply as you commanded in Torah and Genesis. Would you bless them with the joys of having children? And a voice booms down out of heaven, and the voice says, Rabbi, it was not my will that this couple would have a child, but because you have prayed, I will grant your prayer, but you will be barred from life eternal. And so the rabbi sits, and a tear starts to roll down his cheek, and he begins to dance. And the old woman is standing there, the Passover woman, and she says, Rabbi, why do you dance? And he says, all my life I have followed God, knowing that I would seek, and now I get to follow God simply because I love him. Huh. And I love that story too. And there was a third story. Oh, I have this friend in Jerusalem, non-believing Orthodox Jew, and his name's Moshe, and Moshe has this little ministry where he has a storefront, and he invites Christians to come into his storefront, and he shuts the door, and they just talk for like 40 minutes. This Jewish rabbi and Christians. He says, I do this because I used to think that I knew what Christians believed, and I found out I didn't really know. And I found out that Christians thought that they knew what Jews believed, but you don't know what we believe. And so let's just get together and talk about what we believe. And he says, one of the examples that he gives, he says, I remember the day I was like 18, 19 years old when I discovered for the first time that Christians love God. And he's not being funny, and he's not being provocative. And everybody in the room is like, are you kidding? Are you serious? Like you didn't know that Christians love? He's like, no, I didn't know Christians love God. And I found out you guys loved God, and it radically changed my perspective. And everybody's like, what are you talking about? He says, I grew up most of my life believing Christians love salvation.
Wow.
I mean, so when I hear these stories of like this, I live this way because it's the best way to live. It may be an incomplete worldview because I too love the resurrection, and I too think there's something beyond that I would want to affirm and we'll probably draw towards together. But I also think that this person is probably onto something that the whole rest of us we've never probably even tapped into. Like we follow Jesus because of what it gets us. We follow Jesus, whatever. This person's following Jesus because he's like, that's the best way to live. Forgive. And think about the way of Jesus. Forgiveness. Love your enemies. Is that the Jesus he's talking about? Because if the answer to that is yes, he's on to something. And he may not believe in God, but he does.
Yeah.
So I just think, the categories and the labels and the theology and the distinctions are very, very helpful, but they're only so helpful. because I think God is coloring outside of all those lines. I think some of us that are within the box are missing so much. I think those that are outside the box are constantly rubbing shoulders with God and totally get it. And this is what I see in the Gospels over and over and over again. Jesus keeps hanging out with the outsiders, going like, these people get it. And all the religious folk are like, yeah, but we're the ones. And he's like, oh, you're going to miss it. Not only do these people get it, but you don't get it, and you're going to miss it, and they're first in line. Like the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the sinners are entering the feast of Abraham before the Pharisees. And I know that we read that and we're like, yeah, stupid Jews. But this isn't about Jews. This is about religious people that think that they know and speak for God. And so the warning isn't just for them. The warning is for all of us. And I just think what you described is exactly what you see like every time I turn a page of the Gospels. Jesus is like this guy. And everybody's like, but how? He's an agnostic. He doesn't even believe in that. And he's like, you don't, you unbelieving generation. This guy gets it.
Wow.
And maybe I just said a bunch of stuff that'll get me fired. I don't even know, but I'll blame it on the riff.
Hey,
perfect.
This is the unriff episode.
That's right. So what would you say? I think that as we kind of walk through just different situations at our church, right? There's people coming into the doors that are obviously looking for something. They're curious. We're hoping that they're curious spiritually of what this is. We've also got a great number of people that have been in church for a long time, right? And we want to create a safe space for them. But there's a lot of talk on certainty, right? And
yeah,
where does certainty, where should it live inside of faith, right? And should it live inside of faith? And just kind of speak on that for just a minute of kind of walking through what we just did with I follow him because it's the best way to live. Like obviously the people that Preston are talking with and to are not claiming certainty. They're claiming, man, this is the best way to live.
And I'm just so happy you said what you said, because I felt that way and I've said it, but now that Marty Solomon has said it, I'm like,
we're gonna quote him.
Like, hey, if you think I'm a heretic, I'm not. Here's the guy who wrote the book. So yeah, but I agree with that. Yeah. Where does certainty live? Where should it live?
I'll do the same. I'm going to be like, well, Preston said it before I did. He said so on his podcast, so it'd be great. Well, my favorite work on this is The Sin of Certainty by Peter Enns. It's just a phenomenal book and a phenomenal work. And yeah, I think certainty, I love the title because it makes it a sin. But I think certainty is at the very least just far, far, far overrated. Which actually is one of the points that I made a lot on book tour when we would have these Q&As and we would talk about questions of the Bible, and everybody wants to know, okay, but how do I know? How do I know? How do I know? How do I know? And I'm like, guys, we've put our faith in, I think even once I used the word certainty, and we use different words depending on the context of the conversation, but we don't trust God. We trust our theological system. We trust history. That's the one thing that drives me crazy when we equate inspiration of the Bible with historicity. Like, because the Bible is inspired, it historically happened, which is a great conversation and a wonderful wrestling match, but that's not inspiration. And if it is, what worse that faith and inspiration is in history, not in God. Because the word inspired means God breathed. It speaks of the origin, where it came from. That's what makes it inspired. It came from God. No matter what it is, whether it's a poem or a fantasy, or it came from God, and that's why it's inspired. But we think it's inspired because it literally happened. And that's not faith in God. That's faith in history. I think we usually put our faith in certainty. And if I can't be certain, and again, the reason we do that is because of our soteriology and how this whole thing is about going to heaven when I die. So there's always this whole house of cards where everything is leaning on everything else. You can't remove just one, because then everything else kind of falls against everything else. And that doesn't mean the whole thing is bad. It just means maybe there's a different house we can build with the cards or something. I don't know. My metaphor is going to break down really quickly, but I can't remember what your certainty. Yeah, I certainty may be one of our idols, if I could say it that way. Not that the opposite, like I want to be like the least certain person ever about things. But certainty has never been the point. Mm-hmm. If anything, God's done things on purpose to disrupt our certainty, because certainty gets in the way of almost everything from the Old Testament to the New. Yeah. Like if you're certain, you're never going to do what God wants you to do. You're never going to, God wants to do all these things that we would never even imagine. And certainty is definitely going to get in the way of that. And so, yeah, I think certainty is just way overrated. Faith, trust, not blind trust. I'm not talking about blind trust. I'm talking about who is Jesus? Who is God? What is he doing in the world? What has history told us? What have the people of God told us for thousands of years? Because it seems to be pretty good. I'll put my faith in that because it's like the most compelling thing I've ever found. Loving my enemies. Yeah. I mean, that's hard, but that's compelling. When you see that, I went to, I don't know, I'll close with this. I'll close this thought with this. I went to Israel in 2008 with 54 Amish people. It was right after the famous school shooting, where what that community did was later that evening, might have been the next evening, I can't remember. The shooter had shot all these kids in the school and then had turned the gun on himself. They went to the shooter's family's house and made them dinner. Because that's what the Sermon on the Mount told them to do, was to love their enemies. So after a mass school shooting, within 48 hours, the Amish community goes and ministers to the family. That will change the world. I don't encounter that. And that's not a diss on all the other world systems and world religions or theological. I'm just saying that I'll get up in the morning for that. Like I would give my life for that. And it's not even contained with the Christian label. I heard a story once about a Jewish boy that was driving late at night. It was rainy. He'd made a wrong turn. He ended up, I think it was in the West Bank. This is probably a really weird story to tell right now. Ended up running over a Palestinian child. The whole community started to come out. He knew his life was in danger. Somebody got him out of there. Somebody from the community was like, "You got to get out of here. You're dead." They got him out of there, and then they arranged what's called the Solcha meal, where he went over to the family of the boy that had been killed, and there was a father and a grandfather, and they set up a meal because in that culture, if you eat together, you're good. And so they get together for this meal, and the father can't speak; he's too upset, and the grandfather, the patriarch, takes bread and he breaks it and says, "When you take this, when we eat together, two things are going to be true. Number one, we will never speak of this again. And number two, you're a member of my family." That's in a Muslim context. Wow. That stuff is compelling.
Yeah. That's the way of Jesus.
That's not certainty. That is something else, because that makes no freaking logical sense.
Yeah.
And it's not easy, and it's not.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hear that. I'm like, that's God. Yeah. That is God. That's what that has God's face on it, and it doesn't care about our labels, and it doesn't care about our theological systems. And creeds are great. It just doesn't care about our creeds, but they're great. I'm not knocking it. They're great. They're only so great, but they're great. But God's bigger and better than all that. And so anyway, I don't even know what we're talking about anymore. But I'm just like, certainty.
Marty, listen. When I put my kids to bed, this is what they ask me. "Dad, can you tell us a story?" You know, they're of that age. I'm like thinking, how do I get to hear more of Marty's stories? Because the stories that you're telling help us grapple with the text and take us out of dogma. They take us outside of certainty into love, the way of Jesus. So I can't thank you enough for being on the podcast. I'm thrilled that we have this connection. One day we'll meet in person. I know that to be true. I'll drive to you if you never drive here to Springfield. But I just want to say thank you for being on the Riff. What a gift you are.
It's great. And I hope
everybody, thanks for the invitation.
We will definitely link the book on this, so you can just click on that, grab it. Anybody that's listening to the Riff, I'm just telling you, like, BEMA has been life-changing for me, honestly. Like, it's it's opened my eyes to so many different things. So if you're not listening to BEMA,
listen to BEMA, get the book.
Listen to the Riff first, okay? And then listen to BEMA. You've got to, and you got to get this book too. Yeah. You really do. Anything that comes from Marty and his team, I just think is world class. And it's just done with such open hands, and the attitude that you have in it is so needed in the Christian world. And I just appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. I appreciate your team. Appreciate the work you do. And just thank you for being here. Thank you for being on the Riff.
Yeah.
You're welcome. If there's any truth to anything you just said in the last 60 seconds, I just bless God, because that's the work of him, because it hasn't been where I've been, but it's the work that God's doing. So,
well, thanks, awesome. Marty.
Bless
Appreciate
him. Absolutely. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Riff. We'll have a brand new episode every week, wherever you find podcasts.